Welcome to an emergency episode of Pure Cinema Podcast. As some of you might know, within the next week or two, the Academy will be announcing the nominees for the upcoming Academy Awards. Now, while we don't yet know the nominations, there are many predictions as to which films are being considered for the Oscars. I truly believe that this year the Academy is going to make a great mistake and not nominate a film that I believe is easily the best film of the year 2022. 2022, we saw a lot of really great films, some examples of them being The Fabelmans, The Banshees of Inisherin, Tar, Babylon, and many others. However, there was one film in specifically that I think really stood out from the pack, and that film was Charlotte Wells' directorial debut, Aftersun. Now, if you haven't seen Aftersun, I recommend you do that soon. Some of the more indie theaters are still playing it. Some are planning on giving it another run soon. If you can, definitely, this is a film you want to see in theaters. I'm going to talk a little bit later about how this film translates to the at-home experience versus in theaters. However, if you're someone who is unable to get the chance to see this in theaters, still watch it at home. Just try and make sure that, you can find some type of setting where the lights are down and the sound around you is quiet so you can really take in the atmosphere and the sound design of this film. Now, if you have seen this film, I'm about to change your perspective on a couple things. The main thing this film did that is so brilliant and separates it from the other films that are competing for this Best Picture award this year is how this is a truly cinematic film. And what I mean by that is not that it has this big, wide spectacle shots that many people think of when they hear cinematic. One of the biggest misunderstandings about the theater experience is that people think of films with these big sounds and big spectacle shots and real wide landscape shots. And yes, all of that are things that totally you need to watch in a movie theater. However, people forget that another way that the movie theater is very crucial is with the small, quieter films and the really tight close-ups. The way a close-up fills the frame on a gigantic screen has a much bigger effect than if it does on, let's say, a regular TV 55-inch screen. It's also important for these real quiet films because when you watch a film at home, there's a lot of competing sounds and atmospheres, especially if you're someone who lives with other people such as myself and many others. Maybe you have siblings in the other room who are loud, someone's playing music, someone's cooking dinner. There's always competing sounds that take you out of that film experience, especially when you watch a quiet film. And this is a film where the atmosphere is absolutely crucial to your understanding of the film and its experience. So first, I'm going to start with what is that factor that sets Aftersun apart from so many other films. And that is that Aftersun is a film that tells its story cinematically. And what I mean by that, it tells its story using every single production element except for the dialogue. The way Aftersun tells its story is through the images, through the body language, through the sound design, the lighting, the tone, and the music. All of these areas are working together to communicate the ideas and what's going on in the story without actually telling you anything. Charlotte Wells, I heard say in an interview that they actually didn't even rehearse the dialogue. So I'm going to shortly get into breaking down the way the film tells the story throughout all these different elements. But to start off, I want to talk briefly about the way this script is structured, which is another very unconventional thing that the film did. Most films, especially coming from a new writer who's scared to take risks, which many new writers are, understandably. What Charlotte Wells does here is has a narrative more of mood and curiosity, where on the surface it seems like there's a girl who's on a vacation with her father, and there's not really much moving the story forward. There's not this high stakes element, this objective that they need to accomplish by the end of the film. They're kind of just living life in a very normal way. There's not these, real concrete hard plot points like many other films have. And I applaud Charlotte Wells for taking this direction because I'm sure she got a bunch of notes saying, where's the stakes, where's the objective, where's this and that. What she does is she really just lets this play out in the way she wanted to let it play out in a much more realism and unique way. So while the film isn't necessarily held together by that narrative and objective like many other films will do, what holds the film together here is there's this curiosity that something bad is going to happen. No matter what's going on in the film, there's kind of this underlying tension and dread. There's this darkness beneath the surface. And we know that something's going to happen, but we kind of have an idea of what it might be, but we're not totally sure. And this helps keep our interest. And one of the main things that does tie the film together, every so often Charlotte Wells will show us this like strobe light shot with a bunch of dancing and stuff, and we're not really sure what that means until the end. Until we finally get to that dancing scene, and now it all comes together and we're like, oh shit, this is the big moment. So that kind of strobe light shot is what helps keep our curiosity. I'll start briefly by talking about how this film translates to an at-home experience. So I got the privilege of seeing this film twice in theaters. In one of my local theaters, it's going to get another run actually this upcoming weekend, so I'll make sure to see it probably at least another 2 more times. But recently, when preparing for this episode, I watched the film with an at-home experience, and I watched it at night. There were not many competing sounds except for cars outside, and I have to say that it truly didn't have quite the same effect, and that's nothing that's a knock on the filmmaking. It's just the fact that this is a film that immerses you in its landscape and its sound design. There's so many moments here where it just kind of sits with the characters and you kind of just watch them live and just kind of live in the atmosphere. And Charlotte Wells lets the shots, linger a little bit and lets you see the characters really just sit and, kind of think and contemplate life. This is something where the theater experience totally enhances it because you're taking in that sound and it makes you feel like you were in the atmosphere with these characters. Whereas when you watch it at home, sometimes you have to lower the volume. The sounds are not as captivating as they are in a movie theater. So it creates a little bit of more of a distance between you and the story. In a more dialogue-heavy film where people are kind of just following along what the characters are saying, it has a better TV translation because the sound effects are not as important. And as long as you can kind of hear what the characters are saying, you can mostly understand what's going on with the story. But in a film like this, where the sound effects and the sound design are doing a lot to tell you the story and really reflect what's going on with the characters, it might not translate quite as good to an at-home experience. Another example of this is how Charlotte Wells frequently uses a constantly very slow and kind of dreadfully moving camera. In a theater experience, this totally warps your perspective on what you see on screen. Whereas with the at-home experience, the camera moves are so slight at a time, they're not quite as noticeable and don't have the same effect because the screen is just simply a lot smaller. So these are just some reasons why I encourage anyone to try and see it in the theater if possible, because theater to at-home translation is something that not a lot of people talk about, and it's a serious problem, I think, with the industry today. And this is truly a film that, despite being a small-scale film, is totally meant for the theatrical experience. So to start, let's talk about the one award which this film is getting some conversation about, and that is Paul Mescal for Best Leading Actor. So typically when most of us think of, the great performances of all time, we think of performances like Robert De Niro in Raging Bull, or J.K. Simmons in Whiplash, or Daniel Day-Lewis in There Will Be Blood. And what performances like these have in common is they're very, larger than life, a lot of anger, very emotional with these long monologues. Paul Mescal's performance in Aftersun is the opposite of that. Considering that Paul Mescal's performance has none of these, what makes his so great? For pretty much the entire runtime, Paul Mescal speaks in, a very monotone voice with very low energy. His head is almost always down, sort of hiding his sadness, and he's always kind of, hiding his face from the world. The very opening shot of the film is there's his daughter, Sophie, she's recording him and interviewing him on a VHS tape. And as soon as she asks him about what he thought his life would be like when he was her age, it zooms in for a close-up and he dodges and kind of hides his face from the camera, which is a reflection of how he is hiding his sadness from the world. Charlotte Wells goes a step further to freeze frame this shot to emphasize this motif that we'll see play out throughout the entire runtime. And constantly everything Callum does, his entire body language just speaks so much to us. For example, the way he shuffles the deck of cards very slowly. And Sophie kind of watches all of this and is taking it in. She knows that something's up, but she doesn't know how serious it is. One major theme in the film is how he's a very young father. He's even gets mistaken to be her brother at times. He's really not ready to be a father. He's still very much a kid who's figuring out his life himself while also trying to raise a daughter. And we really see a good example of this over dinner where he's telling Sophie about this new idea about how he's going to move in with the friend and start a new business. And it's just very clear here that this is not someone who has his life figured out. He's still young and trying new things, which is great, but it makes it a lot harder when he has the stakes of having a daughter to support as well. And we'll talk shortly about how money comes into play with all of this. Not only does Paul Mescal do a great job of conveying this sadness within the character to the audience without words, but the camera work does a brilliant job of it as well. You might be asking how the camera work lets us know everything we need to know about Paul Mescal's situation. What they do here is a brilliant use of what I like to call edge work, and that is using the edges of the frame. In almost every single shot, Paul Mescal's character Callum is pushed to the edges of the frame. We very rarely see him lined up in the center of the frame, which is very common for most filmmakers to do. It's just simply to frame all of their characters in the center of the frame. Another way to reveal much about a character is to see how this character acts when they're by themselves. One brief example of this is when Callum's at the rug store. There's a slow pan to him, and we just see him leaned up against the rugs, and it's just this very sad body language and expression on his face. No words here, but just that alone lets us know that, there's a lot wrong with this character. He's very tired and depressed. And then we kind of see him get up and change a little bit once someone else enters the room. But just that glimpse of how he acts when he's by himself reveals so much about the mental state of his character. Another example in a scene that plays out much longer than most other filmmakers would allow it to. We see him late at night watching the footage that they had shot earlier. Now, right after in the video, when he hears his daughter talk about how amazing he is, we see him shut the video off, which is not the reaction that most people would expect from something like this. After that, we just kind of see him sink into the bed, and he's kind of just laying in darkness. But by the way the breathing sound effects are, we can tell that he's still awake. And we kind of then, after a little bit of just seeing absolute stillness, see him moving around trying to fall asleep. And just that lets us know that, he really does struggle to sleep at night. And this character clearly has so much going through his head that he was likely watching the video in the first place because he couldn't sleep and was just trying to occupy himself, where sleep is just another area of his depression. A big theme in this film is the things that our parents are going through that we're not totally aware of as children. And multiple times throughout the film, Sophie will very innocently say something, which triggers some type of reaction from Callum. Obviously, the first instance of this is the opening scene. I think the next real triggering thing is the constant motif of the parasails. Throughout the entire runtime, if you were to watch the film muted, you would constantly see the presence of parasailing in the background. Also worth noting that the parasailers are insanely distant and like small dots in the frame, to show how distant this activity is from Sophie. So basically the two of them are laying, and Sophie very innocently asks her father if they can go parasailing. So the first is when they're on a boat one day, Callum tosses Sophie a pair of goggles, and she doesn't notice at the time, and they just sink down. We watch them very slowly sink down in the water, and then we see Callum dive under to get these goggles. And after that, there's just a hold on the water, on the surface of the water above, and we're just constantly waiting for him to pop up, but he never does, which really shows us how deep he went in an attempt to get the goggles. Now, this is really one of the first major examples of Callum's financial struggles and Sophie's awareness of it, where we later see her apologize and try and cheer him up. Shortly after the goggles scene, Sophie's innocently watching the parasailers, and she asks her father if they can do that too. And his reply to this is that they can't because she's too young. But we all know, obviously, that the real reason is because he likely can't afford it and it's likely too expensive. And after this, we just have a long hold on the two of them, and the score eventually noticeably dims out of the sound design. And we just hold on the two of them laying there and just kind of hold with this irony. Another example of those moments where Charlotte Wells just kind of lets the frame linger. So when Sophie's with the older kids, she sees one of the girls has a yellow wristband on, which we learned is an all-inclusive bracelet, which Sophie does not have the privilege of having. And shortly after this, we cut to Callum doing one of his meditation exercises, and we see him here in the very bottom right corner of the frame, framed super tightly by a mirror reflection. It's a great ground swapping shot, which I can get into for a lot of other reasons, but here's another example just visually going from problem, they can't afford this, and then showing visually Callum's mental situation by tightly framing him in the bottom corner of the frame. Now, one more example of Sophie's innocence triggering a reaction from Callum is Sophie talks about and really describes this feeling of just absolute tiredness. We pan over to Callum in the mirror where his body takes up almost the entire frame and only his face is about maybe 1/5 of the frame all the way on the left side. And we just see him kind of hold on this reaction, and this clearly has an emotional effect on him because he knows this constant feeling of being tired. And just by her saying that, we can see how it triggered so many feelings and emotions within Callum, just visually, while the composition of the shot itself also visually reflects Callum's mental state. But ultimately, there's one major example of when Sophie triggers a great emotional response from Callum. There's a rear shot of both Callum and Sophie, and they're both watching a karaoke performance on stage. So Sophie clearly wants Callum to go and join her, but as we've mentioned before, Callum likes to hide his face from the world. He's kind of afraid to really be seen. So he doesn't want to go, and from the dialogue, it seems like this is kind of a tradition that the two of them have. Basically, Callum refuses, and so Sophie runs up. And when she runs up, it's worth noting that we don't focus pull with her. We keep the focus on Callum. And so then once Sophie starts singing karaoke, you got to remember, this is an 11-year-old kid. Having all the spotlight on her is a more nervous moment for her because she's still a kid. And so we see her in her medium close-up shot kind of call him over and kind of try and get Callum to come on stage with her. Eventually, when we cut back to him, he's just simply taking a sip of his beer. And after this, we can kind of hear Sophie mumble some of the words to the song in a very realistic way, and it more shows that she's kind of nervous. And clearly, Sophie's very upset with him that he would not come up and do the karaoke with her. So after this, Sophie, being angry with her father, calls out the money issue. And after this, we can see her kind of trying to hold back a smile and stuff, and Callum kind of leans back in the frame and gets cut out of the frame. I mentioned prior how this story is told with every tool other than the dialogue, And here we see how just one line of dialogue sets off so many things for the father. And basically now what we see is him fall into a complete downward spiral. First we see a shot, and as I mentioned prior, he's almost always framed in one of the edges of the frame. Whereas now we see him in a center frame shot, just surrounded by complete darkness. And this is as he's watching the tape, and clearly the center framing here is not meant to be in a positive way. And now we see a cross-cutting sequence between Sophie kind of off on her own and kind of some themes of loss of innocence and her growing up, cut with Callum as he's just by himself kind of wandering around. And his body language alone lets us know that he's very upset by this and his mind's absolutely racing. All leading up to a point where we see him walk towards a beach and kind of just disappear within darkness. And we don't know if this is him killing himself, what's happening. This connects back to that theme of, the waves, but there's a lot of mystery here and we're not quite sure what happens to him. We then see that Sophie's locked out and we think that Callum's probably still on the beach. However, when she comes in, he is in the bed. This entire downward spiral we see caused by just one line of dialogue from Sophie, which really shows how insecure his mental state is. This karaoke scene ends up coming full circle the next day. As we know, Callum's motive is that he doesn't want to be seen by the world. He doesn't like to be looked at. He keeps his head down. The next day, Sophie feels some guilt about this. So what she does is while they're on some type of trip, she gets everyone there to sing "He's a Jolly Good Fellow" to her father. So originally we see a shot where he is in the top left corner of the frame, highly elevated, and Sophie and all the others are down in the bottom right corner of the frame. And you would think this would be a very nice moment that really is touching to him. Once we cut into a closer shot of him, and this is another one of the few shots where he is center framed, here as the center of attention, we see a more upset look on his face, because his motive for not wanting to do the karaoke, which sparked this whole incident, was being afraid to be seen by the public. And now all the eyes are on him, which, despite being an innocent action from Sophie, is exactly what Callum did not want. And this is where then there's that dissolve to the rear shot of him crying, where it's heavily implied that that cutaway scene is where Callum unfortunately took his own life. And so I just briefly mentioned how Sophie goes off with some of the other kids. So now I want to talk about two very well done scenes where her and a boy who's around her age are playing the motorcycle arcade game. And this is just an absolute perfect example of how Charlotte Wells tells this story without pretty much any words of dialogue. The first of these two scenes, Sophie sits on the bike and instantly plays. And we see the other kid who's there out of focus. And Sophie just calmly plays the game until she quickly glances over at him. And only then does Charlotte Wells focus pull to the guy, visually telling us that there's now some kind of connection between these characters. Sophie has some form of intrigue towards them. And just that one small visual focus pull communicates so much without any dialogue. We also see her look over one more time along with an insert shot where she scratches her arm. After that, we eventually see the guy, whose name is Michael, we later find out, glance back over. So they're planting so many seeds of a relationship between these two characters where they pretty much don't even speak to each other except for their goodbyes. Now, the next time that these two play this arcade game together, what Charlotte Wells does is keep the camera constantly swinging around until we eventually get to a long, symmetrical shot of both of them. But during this, while the camera's moving, the blocking changes between the actors has no effect. Originally, that bike is empty, which leaves a certain level of curiosity, until Michael hops on it as the camera keeps constantly moving regardless of where the actors go. And where she advances the relationship here is by just having their elbows touch. And then we see some reactions with Sophie's facial movements. And I just think that these two scenes are brilliant examples of storytelling without dialogue. In addition, we hear there's a 90s pop song playing in the background where the lyrics constantly talk about these being the best days, which creates a very upbeat and positive mood. Now after this song will carry over into the next shot, which is just a long pan around the resort with a lot of blue sky in the frame. And this will slowly dissolve to the parasailers, which kind of brings back that theme of the parasailers being as a source of conflict for Callum. Now that shot then dissolves, and all these shots are held for a noticeably long time. After that, it dissolves to a reflection of the parasailers from the water of the pool. And what this does is kind of, flip the image upside down, which is then followed up by a shot, which is kind of a tilt up or down, I guess you could say, of Callum upside down in the bathroom. And then we see that this is from Sophie laying upside down, seeing this in the reflection. But what this is doing visually and emotionally is flipping the mood of the story totally upside down. This is then where we get that shot I mentioned earlier of Callum as Sophie talks about she's tired and him tightly framed in the mirror shot. But this is such a brilliant scene transition and how it totally flips the mood from positive to negative. In addition to power cylinders, one more constant theme throughout the film is its use of water. The poster shot is a shot of both father and daughter just facing the waves. The waves are used in many different areas. One way that the film uses water is its use of underwater shots where we see kind of a different perspective on people. And while I'd be lying if I said that I 100% understood what the theme of the waves meant, I do think to a certain degree, when you see people underwater, you're seeing them from a different perspective. And a lot of what this film is about is how Sophie now sees her father from a different perspective, being older now, looking back on these memories compared to the more innocent view that she had as a kid. One example is, they both sink underwater and we see Callum's face underwater, which is another example where visually we kind of just know that something is off. Another example is when she's with the older kids, Sophie sees, kissing underwater, and is starting to learn more about those kinds of relationships as she's growing up. Another example would be the goggles, how they kind of sink down and what that means. And that shot, kind of the way the goggles slowly sink, just creates so much irony, and it really drags out this moment, which is a very big moment for Callum because the price he paid for those is very expensive compared to what he makes. There's so many more shots of, the two of them talking by water or just kind of sitting in the waves. In addition to this, on a darker element is that shot that I just mentioned recently about when, at nighttime, when Callum just walks into the ocean and kind of just disappears into the darkness. So waves and water are constantly used throughout this film. I think there's definitely a lot more to it than I've picked up on up to this point, but they definitely are a very strong visual theme throughout the film. Now I want to get into the imagery of the film and just some other ways that Charlotte Wells tells this story simply through images. What is likely the most misunderstood comments in the history of film is Martin Scorsese's comments saying that Marvel movies are not cinema. And everyone talks about, Marvel movies, this and that, but what people don't realize that he said, because it's not the piece of that comment that grabs the headlines, is he says that the images of those films don't matter. Aftersun, that is certainly not the case. Every single image in this film is super dynamic, very well thought out, and very unique. I mentioned previously how she uses her edge work to draw your eye towards the edge of the frame. One more brilliant use of imagery in this film is there's a scene where Callum's in the bathroom and he has his broken wrist that's hurting him and he's dealing with that, and we're cross-cutting that as he has a conversation with Sophie who's in the other room. And in Sophie's shot, she's wearing more bright colors. There's a very warm light to the room, whereas Callum's shot, it's more close up. We don't see his head because his head's down, as a much more blue, colorless look. And just by showing the two shots of these two characters, lets you know the difference between the mental state of each of them. And just by these two images shows us the differences in the mental state of each of these characters, just by the contrast of them. And while many filmmakers would do is use split screen to visually show them side by side so you see them, this one cuts back and forth between them and then later shows you the split screen, which is a very small decision, but actually a very unconventional take compared to what most filmmakers would have done here. When you see these images side by side, this one shot is the entire core of the film. Because it's also worth noting that now we know that Sophie's back is turned towards Callum, and even though he's in the other room and that realistically doesn't seem to matter, visually what it's representing is how she's not looking at Callum's problems. This perfectly visually represents Callum's struggles mentally. Meanwhile, Sophie is looking straight ahead in the other direction in a shot that's much more warm, much more friendly looking. And all of this is going on behind her back, and it really ties into that core of what Sophie does not see about her father at this time. And one more note about is that Sophie's part of the frame takes up about 3/4 of the frame, where Callum only has about 1/4 of the frame. Another great use of imagery in the film is this shot of the TV, where we now once again see that opening video footage. But here what we also see is a stack of self-help books next to the TV, along with in the top left corner a little glimpse of a mirror where we can see some movement to add some depth to the shot. So here there's 3 possible points of interest. There's the TV, the self-help books, and that little edge of the mirror. And what many filmmakers would do is cut in closer to the video image so we see that fully filling the frame. But Charlotte Wells not only never does that, but just lets this scene play out for a significantly long amount of time, where we're forced to notice the frame, and our eyes wander throughout all different points of focus within this image. Just like in the opening scene, Callum is very uncomfortable by the question Sophie innocently had asked him about how he saw his life in the future, and asked her to shut off the tape, to which we see a shot of the two of them talking through the TV reflection, which is a very interesting and dynamic shot. And these constantly different camera angles and different views that we have on these characters also reflects that theme of, seeing these characters from different perspectives, just like how Sophie is seeing her father now from a different perspective. Another great shot is there's an upside down shadow shot, which might go over actually some people's heads on a first watch, where Callum lets Sophie, who's only an 11-year-old, try a beer for the first time. And this is never actually seen with the actor doing it. It's all seen from a shadow shot, that is also upside down, which I just think is a very creative way to handle a more controversial moment in the film. The camera's also somewhat rotating, unsettling for this shot, and the railing shadows kind of are wavy, as almost as if it's a reflection from a pool or water or something like that. And one more brilliant use of imagery is there's a really nice shot of Callum is holding Sophie and they're dancing together, and it's showed on a darker reflection of the glass, and there's kind of like a double-ish look to it. And I personally feel like this kind of feels like it's almost like a ghostly presence, like it's almost like a fading memory of, you know, the ghost of Sophie's father. And throughout the entire film, there's, in many shots, there's like this very slowly moving camera, almost like it's like creeping up, like there's this darker element that's beneath the surface is about to explode soon. There's always like this creepy, unsettling camera movement throughout much of the film. And, you know, sometimes it's done in the way where it's supposed to call your attention. You're supposed to notice that the camera's moving, or maybe it moves away from a character like it does with Callum here, or the way it moves back from the door on this shot to indicate that something significant has just happened. And now, like I always say, the top 3 most important things in every film. Number 1, music. Number 2, music. And number 3, music. The way Charlotte Wells uses music in this film is, one, for atmosphere and kind of bring you into that time of the late 90s. But also the lyrics of the songs here actually speak much more than the dialogue itself does. One example is in famous song Unchained Melody. And for this one, we cut to them as the lyrics of the song start talking about as time goes by so slowly. And the shot to match this is a near still image. Another, as I mentioned prior, is the karaoke, where the song is Losing My Religion by R.E.M. And the lyrics of this song are very reflective as well, where it talks about, I thought that I heard you laughing, I thought I heard you sing. And this kind of shows how Sophie thought something different of her father in terms of what was going on with him than what he was actually feeling, and how, looking back on it, she really didn't know all of the pain that he was going through. And this is also right before that big moment where she triggers a downward spiral of him. One more area the music is used is there's a song where it keeps saying, come on, and this is during a conversation between the two of them. And the way the music kind of warps into, like, kind of slows down, is it was edited in some way where the sound kind of warps, and this is when we go to one of those strobe light shots. And as far as the musical score is very untraditional and sounds almost like these long, dragged-out notes that are kind of like waves in a way, kind of reflecting that theme of water we see throughout the film. When the film eventually ends, there is like those waves once again, which kind of carry that emotion of the film throughout the credits and really lets you sit with those emotions. And when this film ended, I honestly had no desire to get up and leave my seat. When it ended, I just sat there with all of these emotions and just kind of let them sink in. And the score used at the end really kind of just carries those emotions even longer than the end of the film. But of course, the most memorable piece of music used is Under Pressure by Queen, which eventually is that final dance that the whole film is building to. And it's also worth noting that the film both opens and pretty much closes with Callum dancing. And so the way this one works is each section of the song is like a chapter within this sequence. All, by the way, remind you, no dialogue once again. So in the beginning, it's dancing as new as Sophie. The next chapter would be when she starts yelling at him. This would be the older Sophie. And then the music dims down a bit, and we're not quite sure what we're looking at. And then as we hear the laws in the song, this is where we see young Sophie hugging her father. Until then, the song rises again. And that's where we start to see slow motion until the very dreadful song lyrics of This Is Our Last Dance, where we see the two of them dancing. And that's when we realize what's going to happen. And we realize, and the irony of this film really sinks into a whole nother level here. And so now to wrap things up, I want to talk a little bit about older Sophie, who we don't see a ton of in the film. There's a couple things that are definitely worth noting. To start, we're not totally watching a child's perspective in this film. We're watching the perspective of someone who's older, looking back on childhood memories. Also, the fact that a lot of Callum's struggles are things that young Sophie does not see in the film, which could very well be her projecting some of onto her memories of him. And it also makes you wonder how much of Callum's character is actually a reflection of older Sophie. Older Sophie never really looks happy when we see her. We don't see her much, but she never looks happy when we do. She also wears darker clothes and has, similar to Callum, a very more tired and upset look on her face. Now, this could be because when we see her, she's reminiscing about her father. It's also worth noting that the scene where we see older Sophie is also her birthday, to which right after we cut back to a memory of her father's birthday. This connection between them shows that maybe older Sophie is feeling a lot of the emotions that her father did and is starting to relate to those feelings that he had when she was 11. And this is even further enforced by the fact that twice we hear the sound effect of a crying baby. We never actually see a baby on screen, but the fact that this sound effect is shown twice, one of those being towards the end of the very final shot of the film, which is pretty much a near 360 pan around the room to the final shot of Callum walking off. But right before that, we hear that sound of the crying baby after seeing young Sophie on the tape and after seeing older Sophie. That's when they show us the crying baby. So the fact that this is one of the last things we hear in the film shows that it's very important. And I think the meaning behind that is the fact that Sophie is now a younger mother herself, and she probably is one relating to possibly financial struggles or possibly just the feelings that her father felt in terms of not being ready to be a parent. Well, also the fact that depression is something that they say is genetically passed down, and likely maybe Sophie inherited some of that depressed feeling from her father, which also was foreshadowed in the scene where Callum is looking in the mirror and Sophie talks about how she's being tired and Callum knows those feelings very well. Maybe older Sophie is feeling that depression and is seeing the father from a new lens now because she has those same feelings of depression that she now understands that he once had. And so, to wrap things up, I don't think a lot of people understand how important the Academy Awards really are for cinema. And the reason is because sometimes people say, they overlook this movie or this big budget movie didn't really get a chance. And I think the important thing about the Oscars is a lot of real films that take chances and try innovation and tell like real deep stories with real artistic merit to them, a lot of times don't make a ton of money. And the fact that these films don't make a ton of money, there needs to be some incentive for studios to keep making these types of films. And that's really what the Academy Awards does, is add that incentive to make films like Aftersun and many of the others which were released this year. I think that this is a film that, if it does not get nomination, we're going to look back on in 5, 10, and many years in the future and say this was an absolute robbery, that this film not only didn't win, but did not even receive a nomination. And I hope that this has helped to show you what an artistically genius and creative and innovative film Aftersun was, and why it absolutely deserves a nomination for the Academy Awards this year in Best Picture, Best Director, Best Cinematography, and multiple other categories. Thank you.